The questions and objections I'm going to cover today are, number one, can we trust the New Testament as a historical document? Number two, hasn't the Bible been rewritten so many times that it can't be trusted? Number three, wasn't the New Testament written hundreds of years after Christ? And number four, was the Bible changed? So let's start with the first one. Can we trust the New Testament as a historical document? This one is relatively easy to answer. Scientifically speaking, if you cannot trust the Bible as a historical document, then you cannot trust any ancient document, because there are more copies and fragments of the New Testament than there are for any ancient document in the world. If you look at this chart, which lists the ancient texts with the most copies in existence, you will notice that the New Testament tops the list with 5,600 copies. Coming in second, you have Homer's Iliad with 643. And third is Sophocles with 193. And you can see that it's pretty much downhill from there. In fact, most documents have about 10 or less copies. The next factor that plays a role in the science of textual criticism is the time between when the document was originally written and when the first copies we have of it are. The New Testament again ranks number one of all known ancient texts, with a gap of less than a generation, about 30 or 40 years. And again, Homer's Iliad comes in second, but it has a whopping 500 years between the time that it was originally written and the time that we have the first copy. You can see that with all the other ancient texts, this gap is pretty significant. In fact, there's an average of about 1,100 years between the time that these texts were written and the time that we have the first copies. The next, and probably the most important data point in textual criticism, is the question, do these copies agree with one another? That is, do they all say the same things? And you can again see on this graph that the Bible comes in number one at 99.5% agreement between these texts. And as a side note, the other half of 1% is simple spelling errors and other minor things that don't even affect any part of the narrative. For example, instead of saying Jesus, a variation might say Jesus Christ. To put this in perspective, let's say you have 5 handwritten letters, and they all agree with one another. That would not be too amazing. But the more copies of that letter that there are in existence, the more impressive it is that they do not differ from one another. Now, when you consider that the New Testament has 5,600 copies in existence, the most of any ancient document in the entire world, the fact that all of them agree with such precision is more than impressive. It's totally amazing. And this is also answering the objection that people often say, hasn't the Bible been rewritten so many times that we can't trust it anymore? People make this claim because they're not aware of how the Bible was translated. An author, Matt Slick from carm.org, said the following of this objection. This is a common misconception. Some people think that the Bible was written in one language, translated to another language, and then translated into yet another, and so on, until it was finally translated into English. The complaint is that since, in this scenario, it was written so many times in different languages throughout history, it must have become corrupted. The telephone analogy is often used as an illustration. It goes like this. One person tells another person a sentence, who then tells another person, who tells yet another person, and so on, until the last person hears a sentence that has little or nothing to do with the original one. The only problem with this analogy is that it doesn't fit the Bible at all. Now, you remember our chart where we had 5,600 documents that all agreed with one another to 95.5% accuracy? Well, those documents are written in the Greek language, and all of the world's translations of the New Testament, whether they are English or Spanish, French, Chinese, Swahili, whatever, are translated from the Greek to that language. So there's only one step in this game of telephone. I think that modern English speakers get confused because there are so many English versions of the Bible, like the King James Version and the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, and so on. What the different versions in English do is try to either update the words, since the English language, like all languages, are evolving. So a word in 1611, when the King James Version was written, does not always mean the same thing as it does in 2011. There are other reasons for different English versions too. Publishers sometimes strive to give an even more accurate translation of the Greek texts. See, Greek is a very deep and complex language, and English really isn't. For example, the Greek language has 4 words that it uses for love. One for romantic love, one for brotherly love or friendship, and one for love of a family member, and then agape, which kind of is a love that you do, sort of. Where English has just one word for love. So, yeah, sometimes different Bible versions will try to make a clearer picture of what the Greek language is trying to say. But we can always track that and we can always test them because there are concordances available and lexicons and other things where we can test what they've actually translated it as. So yes, there are different English versions, but all of them have to obey the original Greek texts, which can be easily shown, as we've already seen, not to have been victim to the telephone game idea. Now, none of these questions have been speaking about the truthfulness of the document or making claims of its validity. All that it's doing is saying that you can be sure that what you are reading is the same thing that was originally written. The next few questions have to do with that. The first is, wasn't the New Testament written hundreds of years after Christ? This is actually a really important question that plays into the trustworthiness of the message of the New Testament. To discuss this aspect, I'm going to play a clip from the famous philosopher and Christian William Lane Craig, courtesy of 100huntley.com.
I often hear students say, well, you can't know anything that happened 2,000 years ago. And what they fail to understand is that the crucial gap is not the gap between the time of the evidence and today. The crucial gap is the gap between the evidence and the events described by that evidence. If the gap between the events and the evidence for those events is short, then how long it has been since the evidence in those events to the present day is just irrelevant. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence simply because of the lapse of time. And with regard to the New Testament, when we look at the evidence, what we discover is that these records of the life of Jesus were written down within the first generation after those events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive, with people who had firsthand contact with those who had accompanied Jesus during his lifetime. So that we actually have better sources for the life of Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most of the major figures of antiquity. For example, take Alexander the Great, the great Greek conqueror. Our earliest biographies, earliest sources for Alexander the Great, come from Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet, Greco-Roman historians still regard these records as fairly trustworthy accounts of the life of Alexander the Great. The fabulous legends about Alexander didn't arise until the centuries following those two authors. And contrast that to the New Testament, where we have books and records that are written within the first generation after the events while the eyewitnesses are still alive. So I think that we have very good evidence for the life of Jesus of Nazareth, very trustworthy evidence, and how long it has been since that evidence till today is simply irrelevant to the reliability and trustworthiness of that evidence.
Next, let's look at the idea that the Bible was intentionally corrupted or changed by a nefarious group like the Illuminati. This is a claim that is made all the time. Now again, going back to our 5,600 copies that are 99.5% agreement with one another, they are also from vastly different time periods and were discovered in many different countries. If anyone had attempted to change any of them, it would be the most obvious thing to everybody. All you would have to do to prove the idea that the Bible had been changed is to, say, find one copy that said one thing at an earlier time period, and then find ones from a later time period that said a different thing. It would be the easiest thing ever to do. It would be impossible for a forger to change all of those 5,600 texts without being noticed, most of which had not even been discovered yet. This is why people only make the claim that the Bible was changed, and why you never find anyone offering proof that it was changed. There are lots of scholars that study these ancient texts of the Bible, even scholars that very much dislike the Bible for personal reasons, yet you do not find that these scholars that know these things that I've been explaining today make these claims that the Bible has been changed over the years. They know far better than to claim that. The final thing we will cover is the Gnostic Gospels. This objection has become popular lately with movies and books like the Da Vinci Code. The Gnostic Gospels are writings by the Gnostics that claim to be written by apostles like Peter or Thomas or Judas. The first thing that you should know is that no one, not even the Gnostics, think that these writings were actually written by the apostles. They admit that they are pseudographical. In other words, that they were written by people who simply claim to be these apostles, but were not. The other thing that you won't hear from Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code is that these writings do not show up until almost a century later. It's ironic that the same people that think that the actual Gospels should be questioned because of their teeny tiny gap don't question the Gnostic Gospels, which have a much bigger gap. Not to mention that the Jesus that the Gnostic Gospels portray is not the same Jesus from the earlier Gospels, nor is he the one that's prophesied by the much earlier Jewish writings. Their version of Jesus conveniently conforms to their own religion many, many years later. From a textual criticism standpoint, there is absolutely no question whether or not the Gnostic Gospels are the real Gospels. They are clearly not the real Gospels. The real Gospels in the New Testament were either written by the apostles, like Matthew or John, or the associates of the apostles, like Mark and Luke. The Gospel of Thomas, however, is a 2nd century work that was written well after the time of the apostles. So let's recap. Number 1, can we trust the New Testament as a historical document? Yes, it is literally unmatched in the ancient world for its pristine accuracy. Number 2, hasn't the Bible been rewritten so many times that it can't be trusted? No, if you want to use the telephone analogy, then there were always only 2 participants in the game. Translations went from Greek to the respective languages consistently. Number 3, wasn't the New Testament written hundreds of years after Christ? No, it was written about 30. And as a side note, because of the creeds and other spoken traditions evident in the New Testament, we can actually trace it back even earlier than that. And number 4, was the Bible changed? No, this would be so easy to prove that if it were true, you would hear about this all the time. The Bible's mere endurance speaks for itself. For thousands of years, people have explored every nook and cranny of the Bible. Alleged difficulties have been systematically answered. The more one studies without bias the teachings found in the Bible, the more that you will see that they conform to the truths of experience and human nature. It is just as powerful to the lives of people today as to those thousands of years ago. The question is, what do we do about it? If this is true, then the Bible is by far the most important book on our bookshelves. And what do we make of this man that lived 2,000 years ago, about which was said, "Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness, by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead." I encourage you all to read about Jesus, if for no other reason than because he is the pinnacle of all personality. There is nothing like him in literature or history. He is in a class by himself. Discover him for yourselves in the pages of your Bibles.